Well, good evening, everybody. The Victorian age was, beyond doubt, a religious age. Unlike under the impact of the successes of the French Revolution, of the Reign of Terror, and the wars of Napoleon, skepticism and rationalism of the Enlightenment had given way to a renewal of Christian faith. The historian J.A. Froude was expressing a widely held view when he declared, "An established religion is the sanction of moral obligation. It gives authority to the commandments, creates a fear of doing wrong, and a sense of responsibility for doing it. To raise a doubt about a creed established by general acceptance," he warned, "is a direct injury to the general welfare." And you can just see, this is one of Punch's fancy portraits. Says, after my, he said he was a fan of Carlyle's. "After my death, I wish no other herald, no other speaker of my living actions to keep mine honour from corruption, but soon an honest chronicler as Froude." So that's what Carlyle said. Okay, so Froude was talking really about the importance of the Church of England for establishing order in a world where revolution seemed to be a constant threat. And it's with the Church of England really that I want to start, because it was widely believed, of course, that skepticism of the Enlightenment philosophe had led to the horrors of the French Revolution and the guillotine, and any decline in religious belief amongst the new industrial working classes, who were increasing in number and seemed to be, to conservatives, potential fodder for revolutionaries. Any decline in religious belief was fraught with grievous danger to property and the state, as one Victorian commentator remarked. Now, many Victorians believed that the Bible was the best, indeed in many cases the only guide to a moral life. They saw the hand of God in every event. Indeed, Disraeli once complained, after being worsted by Gladstone in a debate, that the really irritating thing about his great rival was not that he always had the trump card hidden up his sleeve, but that he evidently believed that God had put it there. Success was seen as the reward of virtue, not least, of course, by the successful. Failure was the punishment of vice. And as I argued in a previous lecture in this series, attitudes to death were fundamentally Christian. In the High Victorian period, the dead did not cease to exist. They were merely going to a better place, or so it was hoped. Churches were crowded with parishioners, and although some complained that industrialization and urbanization were alienating the masses from religion, there was scant evidence for that in church attendance figures. When the first national census revealed in 1851 that no fewer than 5 million people had not attended church the previous Sunday, there was much shaking of heads among the pious. But of course, this didn't mean they failed to attend church every Sunday, nor that they'd ceased to believe in God. That was a very long way away from the answers we're expecting to the religious questions in the census. It's about to happen this year, where there are campaigns, of course, to get Jedi inscribed as a proper religion. So what people were looking at was attendance at the Church of England in the first census. But in fact, if you combine it with chapel attendance, it didn't fall between 1851 and 1881. And in absolute terms, it actually grew to around 1905, though still, of course, it was falling somewhat in relative to the growth of the population. But still, you could find religion everywhere in mid-Victorian England. Chained Bibles were supplied on railway stations. Sermons were regularly printed, sometimes became bestsellers. Huge, highly popular efforts were made to bring Christianity to the heathen, especially if they lived in the British Empire. Missionaries like David Livingstone became household names. Now, of course, the Victorians were not unaware of the dangers of an excess of religious dogmatism and enthusiasm, evidenced in history in the Puritan Revolution of the 17th century. And the more intellectual amongst Victorians knew that the literal truth of the Bible had been challenged by German scholars such as David Strauss, whose Life of Jesus, published in German in 1835 and in an English translation by George Eliot in 1846, was described by the evangelical reformer Lord Shaftesbury as the most pestilential book ever vomited out of the jaws of hell. In fact, using modern methods of textual and linguistic criticism, Strauss dismissed the miraculous elements in the Gospels as mythical, along with the allegedly divine nature of his biography subject, and demonstrated just how little hard evidence there actually was for the historical Jesus. Just as disturbing was a demonstration in Sir Charles Lyell's 3-volume Principles of Geology, published between 1830 to 33, and here's one of the illustrations from it, that there was no evidence for Noah's flood. The world had not been created, he argued, and seemed to demonstrate conclusively. The world had not been created on the eve of the 23rd of October 4004 BC, as claimed by the 17th century divine James Ussher. It was far, far older. Well, as a result of all of this, thinking Victorians tended to take refuge in the idea that even if the Bible wasn't literally true, still religion was the only way to explain the world of nature. And in doing so, they were expressing a belief that nowadays I think you'd call intelligent design. A series of treatises published in the 1830s argued, I quote, that design and benevolence were everywhere visible in the natural world. The man who commissioned them was the 8th Earl of Bridgewater, a somewhat eccentric man who dined in his stately home with dogs and cats dressed up as men and women, wearing shoes and breeches, and provided with table napkins, each attended by a waiter. I tried to find an illustration, but well. But his beliefs were, I think, fairly typical. In this view of things, science could only confirm the rational intricacy of God's creation, the divinely sanctioned order of things. Truth, remarked the Cambridge geologist Adam Sedgwick in 1845, truth is most delightful when it reaches us in the form of some great abstraction which links together the material and the moral parts of nature. Now, of course, the problem with the idea of designing for moral purposes, a moral nature, was that it had to accommodate events like the French Revolution. But divinely sanctioned morality could have no meaning without humanly or diabolically inspired immorality, as Bishop Butler had once explained. So suffering was likely to be a divine punishment for straying from the paths of righteousness. Evangelical religion, therefore, inspired men and women to seek to prove themselves to be virtuous by doing good works, by helping the poor, by reforming the world, by spreading the gospel to the heathen. Alternatively, perhaps, like Thomas Arnold, Victorians considered that suffering was sent by God to test the faith of the believer. If you suffered, you weren't necessarily bad. You might be rather like Job, a faithful person being tested. This is a view that Arnold held so strongly that he wrote on his deathbed, "I have suffered so little pain in my life that I feel it's very good for me. Now God has given it to me and I do so thank him for it." But the recovery of faith in the early decades of 19th century Britain didn't mean that Christianity was either complacent, or self-confident, or unchallenged. And challenges came from a variety of sources. In fact, the atheism of the Enlightenment, or the skepticism of the 18th century, were perhaps the least influential and most easily disregarded of these. This was, as I said, a religious age. So direct philosophical attacks on religious faith had relatively little impact by the 1830s. The most public, the most hotly disputed challenge to the established religion of the Church of England came from rival versions of the Christian faith. This meant, in the first place, Roman Catholicism. Ever since the 16th century Reformation, the English, following them, Scots and Welsh, had regarded Catholicism as a form of national treachery. Only gradually had opinion softened as the threat of invasion by Catholic powers like France or Spain had receded. Catholics, like the Protestant dissenters, to whom I'll come in a minute, had long been barred from public office, which is reserved for fully paid up members of the C of E. But in 1828 and 1829, these restrictions were removed by an Acts of Parliament, not least in the Catholic case, in order to try and diffuse mounting tensions in Ireland. So inflamed were parliamentary passions that the Duke of Wellington, Prime Minister who'd introduced the legislation, felt obliged to fight a duel against the Earl of Winchelsea, who had accused him of plotting to destroy the Protestant constitution of the United Kingdom. That both men deliberately missed. Honour was satisfied, but of course the incident was a gift to the cartoonists. Catholic emancipation, as it was known, opened the way to the wider reforms of the 1830s, greatest of which was, of course, the extension of the franchise in the Great Reform Act of 1832. And this was accompanied by the reform of Parliament and the electoral system to the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And the campaign for the reform was strongly supported by nonconformists and by dissenters who were well represented in the new industrial areas of the Midlands and the North, which now got a greater degree of representation in Parliament to reflect their growing population. It was vehemently opposed by the Church of England bishops who had seats in the House of Lords. A growing number of Anglican clerics saw these developments as threatening, especially when the government reduced the number of Irish bishops and proposed to secularize some of their revenues, and followed this with the commutation of church tithes, of local tax that people had to pay to the church, and then the legalization of civil marriage, and marriages carried out in dissenting chapels, and the establishment of a permanent ecclesiastical commission to reform diocesan administration. All of this in 1836 alone. So a group of Anglican clerics centred around the University of Oxford, led by John Henry Newman, John Keble and Edward Pusey, began publishing a series of tracts in which they accused the Whig government at the time of national apostasy, to use their phrase. And they accused Parliament of what they called, quote again, a direct disavowal of the sovereignty of God. And the reason for this, of course, was interfering with the church, interfering with its administration, and extending rights to people who didn't belong to it. As one of these Tractarians, as they came to be called, William Palmer, complained, looking back on these events some time later, "We knew not to what quarter to look for support. A prelacy threatened and apparently intimidated, a government making its power subservient to agitators who avowedly sought the destruction of the church, the state, so long the guardian of that church, now becoming its enemy and its tyrant, enemies within the church seeking the subversion of its essential characteristics, and, what was worst of all, no principle in the public mind to which we could appeal." And the Tractarians regarded the Church of England fundamentally is a branch of the universal church led by the Pope. They led its pedigree back to the church founded in early Christian times and regarded it as part of that wider church, although separated by the Reformation. But they campaigned, therefore, to try and recognize, to get more popular recognition for this fact. They campaigned for the greater use of ritual, for vestments, for Catholic observances in the Church of England. And this aroused increasingly vehement opposition. Pusey, for example, was banned by the church from preaching for 2 years at one point. Eventually, following his own logic, Newman joined the Roman Catholic Church in 1845, later becoming a cardinal. And though neither Keble nor Pusey followed him into the Catholic Church, the movement was not to be stopped. In 1851, following an order by the Privy Council to reinstate an evangelical Anglican vicar who'd denied the real effects of the sacraments, in this case regeneration through baptism, another prominent Anglican, Henry Edward Manning, also converted, later becoming Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster and leading up the newly established Catholic hierarchy in England. Another Punch fancy portrait here, regarding a fancy portrait of what he might have been had he not actually joined the church. Well, now these events agitated Victorians far more than would seem reasonable to us in a much, much more secular age. And they occasioned an enormous outpouring of tracts, pamphlets, speeches, sermons, commentaries. And they went hand in hand, of course, with a wider cultural aspects of a return to the Gothic, to the medieval. Of course, you can see that above all in the neo-medievalism of the architect Augustus Pugin, celebrated also in the secular world with the overtly Gothic style of the Palace of Westminster, which was reconstructed after the old Houses of Parliament burnt down in 1834. And the turn to the Gothic and the Catholic was, among other things, an attempt to rekindle spirituality in an age which was widely seen as being too secular and too lacking in faith. Reaction to perceived crisis of the Christian religion. But much of what the Tractarians and the Oxford movement, as their movement was called, objected to was actually fervently religious too, even though the form it took was not acceptable to Anglo-Catholics as true Christian religion. Dissenting religion had roots in the 17th century. That's when most of the dissenting churches start. But it really achieved widespread popularity with the Industrial Revolution. Now, the Methodist movement, which had begun being founded by John Wesley in 1739, numbered 57,000 members on his death in 1791. It reached 489,000 by 1850. And there were evangelical revivals in Wales and Scotland, and sects such as the Baptists, Congregationalists, Unitarians won more adherents than ever before, mainly because of the growth of industrial, mining, manufacturing districts across Britain, where they had a strong appeal to the new working masses. Among agricultural labourers too, the turn to nonconformity was unmistakable, as the proliferation of primitive Methodist chapels across Norfolk testified. If you drive across Norfolk, you can see them aplenty, though nowadays they're not usually used for religious purposes. Now, however much they differed in points of doctrine, observance, practice, all of these sects emphasized a much simpler form of religion than either the Church of England or the Roman Catholic Church. It was dependent upon the Bible, shorn of ritual, and to attract support, used, as here with a picture of Wesley speaking, used open-air sermons as a means of gaining support and whipping up religious enthusiasm. So these were emphatically the churches of the lower classes. Sometimes, indeed, they presented a spectacle of mass hysteria in the revivalist meetings that led to conversion. Heaven and hell are always close to the evangelical mind. God is always present in everyday life. The rationalism of 18th century religion was replaced by an emotionalism similar in degree, though diametrically opposed in doctrine, to that of the Anglo-Catholics. Now, nonconformity, of course, emphasized above all the need for a sober and orderly lifestyle. Evangelical preachers denounced above all drunkenness. They advocated total abstinence, along with the abandonment of cruel and violent sports like bear baiting, gambling. Riotous behaviour was also rejected. Sexual indulgence was an absolute no-no for evangelical preachers. The demon drink was the instrument of the devil, driving men insane, pulling them down to the torments of hell. And here you can see this poor chap who's been drinking several different kinds of drink. At the bottom there is being his mind is coming all kinds of fighting and other kinds of bad things, but he's obviously destined for a very, very bad end. All of this opened the way, of course, to self-improvement for the working classes. From one point of view, you could see it as a means of inculcating the habits of hard work, regularity, discipline, good timekeeping, sobriety, which capitalism required of the new industrial workforce, combined, of course, with a predestinarian submission to the grim realities of everyday life. God had ordained it, therefore it must be. From another point of view, of course, it could be seen as a spur to democratic reform in the political world. It encouraged reading and education. It engendered a self-respect amongst workers when employer paternalism was being replaced by the ruthless exploitation of industrial capitalism. A sober, God-fearing, orderly Methodist worker could feel morally superior, both to the spendthrift aristocrat and to the self-indulgent bourgeois. As the Baptist leader Robert Hall said, "We see whole kingdoms start from their slumber, the dignity of man rising up from depression, and tyrants trembling on their throne. Man seems to be becoming more erect and independent. He leans more on himself, less on his fellow creatures. He begins to feel a consciousness in a higher degree of personal dignity and is less enamoured of artificial distinction." So nonconformity can have a powerful political effect that eventually found its way into the trade unions of the 1850s, 60s, and the Labour movement. As Keir Hardie, founder of the Labour Party, declared, "I myself have found in the Christianity of Christ the inspiration which first of all drove me into the movement and has carried me on in it." Evangelical religion carried with it quite often a kind of strong dose of millenarianism, in which prophecies of the defeat of wickedness, second coming of Christ, the end of the world, and the last judgment, and the last battle, and the great rapture offered a satisfying counterweight to the injustice and exploitation of the present. Apocalyptic visions were present in the popular, much reproduced paintings of John Martin, known not without reason sometimes as Mad Martin. They found their ultimate expression in the movement founded by the prophetess Joanna Southcott, who wrote 65 books of prophecies between 1792 and 1814, sealing each one for a prescribed number of years. When she died, Southcott's followers first of all refused to bury her body in expectation that it would rise up again from the dead, but when the smell got too bad, they changed their minds. There she is. Her successor, John, or as he called himself, Zion Ward, shoemaker, enthralled huge crowds with his rhetoric until he had over 100,000 followers. Southcott left behind her a black box of prophecies to be opened only in time of national crisis in the presence of 24 bishops, as she said. After failing to persuade the bishops to open it to the Crimean War, or even in the First World War, The Southcotians eventually got the bishop to unlock it in 1927, when it was found to contain a lottery ticket, pistol, and assorted other items, but no prophecies. However, the Southcotian Panacea Society claims it was the wrong box. It still possesses today one that has yet to be opened. But by mid-century, religious fervour of this kind, which you find right across the country in the 1830s, early 40s, had declined very sharply. The dangers to Christian faith seem to become more acute than ever. But those intellectuals who abandoned religion at this time were in a very small minority. They did so, ironically, because they found the religious intolerance and dogmatism that characterized all the debates in this field in the 1830s and 40s unacceptable. Crucially, by 1850 or so, the high noon of mid-Victorian liberalism, it seemed less dangerous, less sensational, less subversive to renounce your faith and declare your agnosticism, as James Mill and George Grote did, among others. This is a small number of intellectuals. And in the longer run, the greater threat to faith was indeed to be posed by science. To begin with, as I've already pointed out, Victorians reacted to the work of a man like Lyell or Strauss by taking refuge in a naturalistic theology which posited the existence of a grand divine plan of nature, putting human beings, the only creatures endowed with a soul, at the centre of God's great design. And they sought to deal with further scientific discoveries by incorporating them into this system of belief. But all of them believed, of course, that God had created everything at one go, in an appropriately perfect and unchangeable form. As Adam Sedgwick said in 1845, as a matter of fact, species do not change, and the fixed organic laws of nature are the first principles of physiology, in the same way that the fixed laws of atomic combination are the first principles of philosophical chemistry. But it was getting increasingly difficult to uphold this view. Robert Chambers' anonymously published book, Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, brought out in 1844, laid out a description of the natural world which began with the solar system and ended with the emergence of humanity, asserting that human beings were simply one kind of animal, as he said, one kind of animal considered zoologically and without regard to the distinct character assigned to them by theology. And they were, from his point of view in this book, one kind of creature along with all the others, some of which, like the mammoths, had clearly become extinct. As Sidgwick declared, if the book is true, the labours of sober induction are in vain, religion is a lie, human law is a mass of folly and a base injustice, morality is moonshine, our labours for the black people of Africa are works of madmen, and man and women are only better beasts. But the scandal caused by this book had largely disappeared by the 1850s. Following on the defeat of Chartism and the defeat of the 1848 revolutions on the continent, dangers of revolution finally seemed to be receding, and with them, for many, the need for religion as a guarantee of order. In the 1840s, the naturalist Charles Darwin, who'd collected fossils and observed the variety of species on the Galapagos Islands during his voyage on the ship the Beagle from 1831 to 1836, had kept quiet about the theory he built on his observations, the theory of evolution by natural selection and adaptation of the species most suited to their changing natural surroundings. And he kept silent because, among other things, he feared it might undermine religion and therefore incite unrest. A view confirmed amply by the hostile reception accorded to Chambers' work in 1844, which accused him of doing exactly that. It's an illustration from Chambers' book of the extinct mammoth. at the same time, however, of course, Darwin satisfied himself that his work was not a threat in itself to religion. And here's a quote from it, from 1844, the same year as Chambers published his book. The contemplation of the works of the creation necessarily leads the mind to that of the Creator himself. The naturalist, wrote Darwin, traces from the bulk and strength of the massive elephant to the almost invisible structure of the minutest insect a mutual dependency that convinces him nothing is made in vain. He feels, too, that at the head of all this system of order and beauty, preeminent in the dominion of his reason, stands man. He sees himself the favoured creature of the Creator. Darwin, in other words, came to feel that his work would strengthen natural theology rather than challenge it. And prompted by the threat of being scooped by another naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace, who'd independently come to similar conclusions, Darwin finally published his book on the origin of species in 1859. It opened with the boldest possible statement that, quote, the view which most naturalists until recently entertained, and which I formerly entertained, that each species has been independently created, is erroneous. Species, he said, had not been made in their final form by God, but they changed and evolved over time. Sometimes, as with dogs, or racehorses, or racing pigeons, this could be done by deliberate breeding. But overwhelmingly, Darwin argued, it happened naturally. Now, for Darwin, this was a cause for optimism, as evolution would proceed further towards perfection, and his linkage of evolution to mid-Victorian optimism, along with his manifestly Christian interpretation of the natural order and the preparatory work done by Chambers and Lyell, softened the blow to religion struck by the publication of his book. Moreover, this is a scientific work, not a popular tract, so its immediate impact was correspondingly limited. It was a very Victorian book in other ways too. As Friedrich Engels pointed out, you could read Darwin's principle of the struggle for the survival of the fittest simply as importing into the natural world the principles of industrial capitalism. Still, despite all of this, Darwin's work aroused the accusation that by taking morality out of religion, out of nature, by taking religion out of theology, out of contemplation of the natural world, he degraded humanity into the mere product of mechanical processes with no divine will behind them. In the biologist Thomas Huxley, he inspired an enthusiasm for propagating his ideas that quickly brought them widespread publicity, and Huxley the nickname of Darwin's bulldog. In 1860, Huxley debated Darwin's theories with the Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce, the British Association for the Advancement of Science. That's Darwin. According to and there's the Bishop, and there's Huxley. According to a later account, and I'll quote from this some length, the Bishop rose, and in a light, scoffing tone, he assured us there was nothing in the idea of evolution. Rock pigeons were what rock pigeons had always been. Then, turning to his antagonist with a smiling insolence, he begged to know, was it through his grandfather or his grandmother that he claimed his descent from a monkey? On this, Mr. Huxley slowly and deliberately arose. A slight, tall figure, stern and pale, very quiet and very grave, he stood before us and spoke these tremendous words, words which no one seems sure of now, nor I think could remember just after they were spoken, for their meaning took away our breath, though it left us in no doubt as to what it was. He was not ashamed to have a monkey for his ancestor, he said, but he would be ashamed to be connected with a man who used his great gifts to obscure the truth. No one doubted his meaning. The effect was tremendous. One lady fainted and had to be carried out. Many people jumped out of their seats, including myself. Now, as all of this suggests, the debate made Darwin and his theories famous. Soon, of course, the caricaturists got to work. Here's one depicting Darwin as an ape, underlining the threat that his theories seemed to pose to religion. For if evolution by natural selection is true, then at what point in evolution had humans acquired a soul? Was the soul itself simply the product of evolution, or didn't it exist at all? As the debate raged, so cartoonists began to use it in political caricature too, as this cartoon of Disraeli by Sir John Tenniel shows, reporting Disraeli's speech in Oxford in November 1864. The question is, Disraeli asked, is man an ape or an angel? Now I'm on the side of the angels, he said, which of course reflects, as Tenniel shows brilliantly, Disraeli's extraordinary vanity as much as anything else. So whether Darwin liked it or not, the popular debate on the theory of evolution pitted evolutionism against creationism, facts against faith. And facts and the positivist belief in the supremacy of facts was central to the Victorian belief system. Now, what I want is, says Mr. Gradgrind in Charles Dickens's Hard Times, published in 1854, facts. Teach these boys and girls nothing but facts. Facts alone are wanted in life. Plant nothing else. Root out everything else. You can only form the minds of reasoning animals upon facts. Nothing else will ever be of any service to them. That is the principle on which I bring up my own children. This is the principle on which I bring up these children. Stick to facts, sir. Might have been said by Michael Gove contemplating the reform of the history curriculum, but that's another issue. Positivism, the doctrine developed by the French thinker Auguste Comte. There's Auguste Comte. Positivism was developed by Comte in the 1840s and made available in English in his major work, A General Review of Positivism, in 1865. It held that scientific observation was the only legitimate basis for action. A priori beliefs of all kinds had to be jettisoned. Only what could be seen, observed, verified, reported was true. The champions of Christian faith, of course, would have none of this. As one of them wrote, mockingly, there was an ape in days that were earlier. Centuries passed and his hair became curlier. Centuries more and his thumb gave a twist. And he was a man and a positivist. Facts, the positivists believed, were out there waiting to be discovered. And the enticing prospect opened up of a time in the future when every fact would be known. And if the scientific method was applied to every discipline, then all the facts would be known about everything. History, for example, should, in the view of Lord Acton, Regis Professor in Cambridge, at the end of the century, satisfy the scientific demand for completeness and certainty. Indeed, some considered this already to be the case in some fields. When the young German physicist Max Planck asked his supervisor for advice on whether he should embark on a doctoral research, he was told firmly it was a bad idea, since everything that was to be known in physics had already been discovered. Such optimism reflected the fact that in the Victorian era science was becoming professionalized. It was once, of course, the domain of gentlemen of independent means, of intellectual clergymen, aristocrats, gifted amateurs. And it now began to move in this period into the universities, which had previously been devoted to preparing young men for service in the church, the law, other similar fields. The term scientist, in fact, was only coined in 1834. The Cambridge Natural Sciences Tripos was founded in 1851 and only gradually gained in popularity. Laboratories earlier in the century existed not in universities but in establishments like the Royal Institution, as in this. As in the Royal Institution, Kelvin's laboratory in Glasgow, which this is, was set up in a disused wine cellar, the adjoining coal cellar, whereas one of his students complained there was no special apparatus for students' use in the laboratory, no special hours for students to attend, no assistants to advise and explain, no marks given for laboratory work, no workshop, even no fee to be paid. Students experimented in spite of the atmosphere of coal dust, which settled on everything, produced by a boy coming periodically to shovel up coal for the fires. Only in 1874 did Cambridge establish a purpose-built physics laboratory named after the Chancellor of the University, William Cavendish, Duke of Devonshire. This underlined the importance of British research in theoretical physics when Thomson, Rutherford and Clerk Maxwell led the field. But it's a development of the later Victorian period. By this time, of course, standard procedures were being developed in teaching and research. Dissection in biology, for example, or standard experiments in physics and chemistry following textbooks written telling you how to do them and what their importance was. And all this replaced the old system whereby students had actually just set up whatever experiments they fancied, often with disastrous results. Technical assistants began to be appointed. Standardized equipment began to be manufactured, taking advantage, of course, of the mass production systems developed by the new industrial world. Microscopes, telescopes became more sophisticated. Chemical dyes made it easier to observe microbes and bacilli. By the end of the century, scientific research and education were recognizably similar to what they are today. Science began to become incomprehensible to the layman as it became more specialised. This wasn't all good news for Victorian Britain, the land of the gifted amateur, where scientific training tended to lag behind Germany and other continental countries. The greatest medical discoveries of the age were made by Pasteur and Koch. British chemists went increasingly to German universities to get a PhD. Science-based chemical and industrial industries are more advanced in Germany than in Britain, where the Industrial Revolution had begun largely as a kind of tinkering about with machinery of mechanics. It didn't require a sophisticated scientific input. And this already began to have economic effects by the end of the century. The gap was signalled in popular culture by the new image of the scientific professor who almost invariably spoke with a guttural accent as he was preparing malodorous concoctions and dangerous explosions. By the end of the century, the new genre of science fiction was gaining in popularity, with H.G. Wells publishing both The Time Machine and The War of the Worlds in the 1890s. But scientists in fiction were still often foreign, tradition going back, of course, to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, found in Joseph Conrad's Secret Agent, where the professor, this man who's constantly wearing a belt made of explosives, is certainly not a British chap, and another form in Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, who, of course, clearly received his scientific training in Germany or possibly Austria, but certainly not in Britain. What science offered by the late 19th century was the exploration of the natural world in all its aspects, in this positive spirit of collecting facts, the collection, the interpretation of new facts. Explanation, exploration went together. Discovery was central to the Victorian concept of knowledge, turning explorers like Burton and Speke into national heroes. Their exploits in the search for the African Great Lakes, the source of the River Nile, in the late 1850s and early 1860s became almost a national obsession. Their reports to the Royal Geographical Society were major public events. As exploration opened up the continents of Africa, Asia and Australia to European knowledge, attention turned to to the North and South Poles. Robert Falcon Scott, who died in his ill-fated journey back from the South Pole in 1912, became another national hero, a story learned by every Edwardian schoolboy. Soon these explorations promised the whole of the world would be discovered to be nothing new to be learned about it. While astronomers explored the solar system and the universe, medical scientists explored the world of germs and microbes, discovering the causes of a whole range of diseases, though very seldom moving on from this to work out a cure for them. The human body was open for exploration. Soon, scientific methods were being applied to the human spirit as well. And the lead here was taken initially by the new science of phrenology, developed early in the century by Franz Gall and by his disciple Johann Spurzheim, who lectured in Edinburgh and passed on his method to George Combe, whose writings on the subject was crucial, I think, to its popularisation in England. Combe's book, The Constitution of Man Considered in Relation to External Objects, published in 1828, sold 300,000 copies by 1859, making it, by one calculation, the fourth best-selling book of the second quarter of the century, after the Bible, Pilgrim's Progress, and Robinson Crusoe, which is also, of course, a religious book in many respects. At the height of its popularity, phrenology was popularised by more than 200 lecturers touring the country, spreading its tenets to mechanics institutes where it was particularly popular. It was democratic too. Anyone could master its basic principles. It's a form of what you might call popular or plebeian science rather than professional science. Phrenologists believed that the mind was made up of a variety of different mental, spiritual and moral faculties, each located in a different part of the brain. Each individual possessed these faculties in a different combination and to different degrees. This is reflected by the size of the area each faculty occupied in the brain, so you could measure a person's personality by measuring the area of the skull overlying each particular faculty, or rather where the phrenologist thought the faculty was located. Combe, seen here giving a lecture in 1826, believed that the individual could work to improve himself and thereby alter the pattern of the bumps on his head. The word expand some areas and contract others, and it's reflected by when they come out. He encouraged thrift, orderliness, punctuality, hard work, and cleanliness. So it's not surprising his theories are popular in this age of headlong industrialisation. Yet phrenology declined sharply after 1850 as its arbitrariness and its medical absurdity became steadily more apparent. Science and medicine themselves became more professionalised. Phrenology was classified as a pseudoscience. Tellingly, it was rejected by the British Association for the Advancement of Science not long after its foundation in the 1830s. But what replaced it was another continental import, the doctrine of animal magnetism or mesmerism, devised by the Austrian doctor Franz Anton Mesmer in the 1790s and popularised by French physicians in the 1820s. It became popular in a series of experiments carried out by Dr. John Elliotson at University College Hospital, London, in 1837 on two domestic servants who suffered from hysteria and epilepsy. Elliotson claimed to cure them by passing an invisible magnetic fluid from his own body to theirs, thus warming them up and driving the ailment away. Mesmerism, or what we now call, I think, hypnosis, quickly gained currency in a wide variety of social circles, though it was discredited when it was revealed that Elliotson's subjects had in fact been pretending all along. They never had epilepsy or hysteria. Doctors quickly abandoned its use in operations, and this had the very welcome side effect of spurring them on to develop chemical anaesthesia, with the first operation under ether being conducted at UCH in 1846. Of course, whereas mesmerism depended very much on the cooperation of the patient. Putting the patient under, knocking him or her out, not only guaranteed the operation would really be painless, but also restored the surgeon's authority, making it no longer dependent on the patient's cooperation. This is an early operation under anaesthesia. In the second half of the century, these methods began to give way to a variety of new theories of the mind, as psychology, cut loose from philosophy, began to divide into experimental physiological investigations of the brain and the nerves on the one hand, and intelligence and perception testing on the other. Most of the running here is again made by American, French and German scientists. By the end of the century, new theories of individual human behaviour were beginning to emerge, notably in Vienna, where the neurologist Sigmund Freud began to develop the theories and techniques of psychoanalysis from the 1880s onwards. Freud, is also worth noting, began by using hypnosis, only later went on to use the talking method to release the repressed emotional urges of his patients on the consulting couch. Other links between Freudianism and mesmerism are fairly obvious, so too are their links with religion, with the surrender of the mind and soul to a higher power, the cathartic effects of confession. Science met religion in other ways too, as Max Planck and then Alfred Einstein exploded the certainties of the Newtonian universe at the turn of the century, undermining Victorian positivism by destroying the idea of an objective observation of discrete facts and replacing it with the idea of the relativity of the observer. And you noted through the lecture that there are all sorts of parallels, for example, between phrenology and its doctrines and dissenting religion, advocating the same kind of moral life. But after Max Planck and Einstein, the universe could no longer be understood in simple material terms. And by the end of the Victorian era, the world was becoming more mysterious and not less. The attempt to apply the scientific method to human society seemed to have fallen foul of rival theories and approaches that made for even more doubt and contention. And one of the most contested of these areas was that of race, which emerged for a considerable amount of time in the Victorian era as another kind of science. And that, together with the rise of empire in the Victorian period, will be the topic of my next and final lecture in this series on the 11th of April. Thank you very much. Just time for a few questions. There is a roving mic, so if you stick your hand up, it will come to you.
Thank you. I know that in some American states, biology teachers are banned from referring to Darwin's views. I just wondered, given the emphasis upon religious belief in the 19th century, were there other similar frictions at that time in terms of what was permissible, what wasn't permissible in terms of teaching?
The short answer is really no. I mean, it depends what you're looking at. This is quite a late development, so that you don't get Darwinian views taught in universities until obviously the later Victorian era. But there's no attempt by any governments or local authorities to ban them, as far as I'm aware. What public opinion held was a different matter. Of course, the churches resisted it very strongly. But I'm told that I read recently that something like 40% of Americans do not believe in evolution. So, particularly in the southern states of the USA, there's a good deal of popular support behind the banning of Darwinian teaching from the schools, or at least from teaching Darwinism and intelligent design on an equal footing. Yes?
Could you say a few words about the role of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert as a role model for a Christian family?
For the Christian family, yes. In two respects, I think. Of course, they were deeply religious, and Albert was deeply religious, but he was also, of course, very keen on science. Albert was encouraged technical developments, was one of the inspirations behind the 1851 Great Exhibition. And, of course, Queen Victoria was very happy to use chloroform when she gave birth to one of her children, when it became available. and thought it was a tremendous blessing. So I think they were equally prominent on both fronts. Any more questions? Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. I look forward to seeing you on the 11th of April.